Good morning. I'm aware I'm breaking the rules with the glass, but I have a bit of a sore throat. Nothing to worry about, by the way. Okay, so I'm supposed to tell you something about the lessons we've learned throughout our pilot chain. So we took a couple of supply chains, both from the part of KU Leuven as well as UZ Leuven, and we've tried to set a few first steps towards a more, let's say, a more diligent supply chain. So first of all, let me give a little bit of background as to why we picked these particular supply chains. So as my colleague mentioned, ICT, academic literature, and fresh vegetables. So of course, first we had to select these supply chains. So what we first did, of course, before we can select supply chains, we needed to know what our university and what university hospital is buying. So we started with a basic, what procurers would call a spend analysis. So an overview of what you're buying as an organization. And based on that spend analysis, we then indeed conducted a basic risk analysis. And of course, we didn't do all of the groundwork ourselves. There was already quite some evidence available. So we've tried to identify those supply chains that contain risks for human rights. And that is indeed the image you're seeing here, the one that was already presented by my colleague. Next step, we selected the pilot supply chain. So how did we do this? If we look at international norms, and they've already been mentioned, UN Guiding Principles, OECD guidelines, they will say that you have to prioritize the risks that are most severe and most likely. Of course, in reality, as a procurer, as an organization, there are also pragmatic decisions that would play a role in your selection of, in this case, our pilot supply chains, or your priorities that you want to engage with. So what are these pragmatic factors? First of all, the procurement cycle. Of course, as public buyers, you are bound by a procurement cycle, and you have to change or at least put out a tender every 4 or 5 years, and then switch suppliers in case there's a more interesting offer. This, of course, has an impact on why you would choose a particular supply chain, because you need to engage, of course, with the supplier. The second factor is the ongoing sustainability initiatives. Of course, there is an interest in building on initiatives that are already there. Thirdly, we had a couple of project partners, each with their own preference for particular supply chains. So for instance, Ricolto obviously would not work with ICT equipment, but it's more akin to everything that has to do with vegetables and agriculture. And then fourthly, it was also important precisely because it's pilots to choose emblematic supply chains, meaning supply chains that sort of represent the identity of a university hospital. And that is obviously why we ended up with academic literature. So once we selected the pilots, the next step would be to try and understand the risks in these supply chains. So the first supply chain, the one of ICT, as you know or may not know, there is already quite some evidence on risks throughout the ICT supply chain, and this is actually an infographic that was designed by Fair ICT Flanders, which was a project that was implemented in parallel with ours, same subsidies, by the way. But in this case, we don't need to invent the hot water, to reinvent the hot water. There was quite some evidence available, and it was quite easy to identify the risks that could occur throughout these supply chains. This, of course, was an entirely different story where it comes to academic publishing. And this is admittedly let's say the strange supply chain in this story. So what did we want to know? When I, as an academic, submit what you could call a raw manuscript, a basic manuscript, it is a Word file. In my case, at least. I don't know whether it's true for all academics, but I submit a basic Word file. It is then, at one point after peer review, accepted by a publisher. And then it enters into production, and you literally receive an email saying, okay, your article has been accepted. It now moves into the production stage. And then a couple of weeks, in most cases, sometimes it's days, sometimes months, you end up with something like that. So a nicely polished, a nicely layouted article that is then published online and in print. So we wanted to know, what does production mean? What happens in between? And does it imply any risks for labor rights or human rights violations? First of all, there was very limited evidence. So we tried to look for evidence in literature. It was very limited. We've tried to contact the publishers, so our suppliers. The response was limited. It varied. Some suppliers were more willing to engage with us than others, and the ones that are not willing to engage, I mean, you can guess who they were. We've also, we've tried to really triangulate the evidence. So we've tried to establish contacts with independent publishers, with suppliers, with academics. And also, and that is the important part of the story, of course, we try to get in touch with the people who are actually working on our manuscripts. And this turned out to be rather difficult, mostly due to COVID. The initial plan was to set up field research in India, where a lot of this editing takes place. But then COVID came, and it hit Chennai, where most of these companies are based, particularly hard. So it became very difficult, of course, to do any kind of field research. So eventually, the backup, the second option was to try and contact them through LinkedIn, through Facebook. And I literally started contacting people that worked on a book on which I was collaborating. And this somehow worked out, and we were able to collect a few testimonies. And based on all of these different sources, we were able to compile a basic supply chain. So what we knew was peer review, enters production, and then it's published. That's it. So then we found out more or less what happens in between. You have different stages in which the article is being edited, in which it's being layouted, in which it's the text is being copy edited and typesetted. So this is the production stage. The thing is that what we assume that the publishers are doing is actually not the job of the publishers, but it's the job of suppliers. So you have different types of suppliers, large multinational companies, smaller publishers, but also, okay, there's an automatic animation, but also very small companies that are really doing specific tasks for these bigger suppliers. So that's one part of the story. Yeah, that's not supposed to be there yet. The other part of the story, and it's related to that, is the increased reliance on freelance editors. So increasingly, publishers are relying on freelancers, especially where it relates to very specific books or articles that require specific expertise. They will rely on freelance editors that are then hired either directly, so the arrow there, or through platforms, such as academic journal editors or Upwork, which you may know in another context. But this is really, the type of freelance platform work that we are increasingly witnessing in different sectors. So what then could be the risks? First of all, as I mentioned, a lot of the basic editing work is being done in India, Philippines, Madagascar, when it's French, apparently, Morocco. So this is the first, this is the call center challenges that you may or may not be familiar with. Dull office work, underpaid, long hours, long days, very high degree of turnover in the workforce. And then secondly, of course, everything that has to do with freelance work, platform work, and the immense pressures under which these people operate, often for very low prices, very competitive, often young university degrees. I hope this stops at one point. Okay, so for the academic literature, if you want to know more about it, I can surely tell more about this at another time. The vegetables was somewhere in the middle. There is increased evidence about the conditions under which our vegetables are being grown. A lot of them are not being grown in Belgium, but in Southern Europe, so Italy as well as Southern Spain. We know from Netflix series, from newspaper articles, from different sources, we know that there's a lot of issues in the greenhouses in southern Spain, for instance, and relates both to the environmental impact. The amount of plastic being used and being emitted into the environment is simply immense. And then you have everything that has to do with labor rights violations. Indeed, as Olga mentioned, the fact that they don't earn minimum wage, it's often irregular migrants that are recruited through, let's say, indistinct clandestine channels and are then made to work in these very tough conditions. And these farms are then linked through various intermediaries, one intermediary, in some cases up to 3 or 4 intermediaries, to the suppliers in Belgium. So the supply chain is not as complex as, for instance, ICT, but there are several layers that need to be disentangled. But I don't have time to go into the details here, and actually my colleagues are better positioned to do this in this particular case than I am. So understanding risk was the obvious next step. Engaging with risk is then the next one. What do you do now that we know these risks? First of all, there's a series of actions that would qualify as socially responsible procurements. So for instance, in the case of multifunctionals, so these big printer copiers, there was a new tender that was being launched. So we tried to use this tender as an opportunity to experiment with a few things. So first of all, we send out a supplier questionnaire. It's a kind of market consultation before the tender was, before, I think, just to assess the extent of maturity in the market. Because of course, as a buyer, you don't want to end up in a situation where no one is able to respond to any of the criteria you put in a tender. So first of all, we had to find out, is the market able to respond to certain questions in a tender? So we consulted the market, responses varied. Japanese companies in general don't perform that well in this domain. So that's one thing. The other thing, and as Olga mentioned, a due diligence clause, which is a performance clause for the public buyers who are present. So what we do essentially is we ask the supplier to enter into an open, constructive dialogue, to provide us with certain information about our supply chain, to work towards an improved understanding of risks in the supply chain. At the same time, coupling these to a couple of hard requirements, such as annual meetings, annual reporting, delivering information about where components are produced, where suppliers are based. So it is a performance clause. It's rather open-ended, but at the same time, there are some hard requirements because otherwise there is a risk that suppliers will simply not budge. So that's the second thing. By the way, this was partly based on the electronics watch clause that I understand Olga has played an important role in the development. Next, of course, the question, what do you do once you have a due diligence clause and you ask suppliers to take certain steps? Of course, it's important to follow up on these steps, and that's why you enter into a dialogue. And this is something that I understand is very challenging for a procurer who is not really aware about these issues and challenges across very complex supply chains. So in this project, of course, we could also play a role in this dialogue. It was very interesting. But of course, the question is, how can you make this more systematic at the level of procurement in this case? So we've engaged in discussions more or less systematic with different suppliers. I think the most important one was HP, the new framework suppliers of our laptops, desktops. It was a very interesting experience. Other experiences were in textiles, so the working clothes of university. The big publishers, of course, which was a very tricky discussion because they, of course, have their story ready. They will refer to audits. They will say everything's fine, but everything is not fine. The problem is, how do you get past the, let's say, the mainstream CSR story? And then the supplier of vegetables to the university hospital. I'll get back to those in a second. Aside from our suppliers, we also try to engage with other stakeholders, I think rather successfully. Of course, VLIR is part of this project. The Shift is also part of this project. Electronics Watch is a very obvious partner where it relates to ICT because they have the knowledge, they have the know-how, they have the network, they have connections, not just here, but also in very far-flung places. For ICT Flanders, again, because we were working on this ICT supply chain, it was an obvious partner, so we tried to take steps together with them. In the case of academic literature, it's interesting to note, for instance, that there is an initiative in the UK by the large publishers, but it's really focused on environment. And to the extent that they also relate to human rights, it's about the printing industry in Malaysia. So that's the book chain project. There's everything that has to do with open access publishing. There were some, let's say, contradicting objectives in our, let's say, there were joint interests, but there were also some contradictions in the way they engage with the story, because of course they want to pressure suppliers, publishers into offering things for free. Offering things for free, of course, means that you have to cut costs elsewhere, and that often means your supply chain. So long story short, we try to engage with different stakeholders to strengthen our understanding of a supply chain, but also to try and engage with these risks. Okay, the lessons we've learned. We've identified 5. First lesson, and it's also a lesson that is obvious to some extent today, human rights in supply chains risk falling through the cracks. What does this mean? It's something that everyone finds important, but at the same time, it's something that not everyone feels an operational connection to. So for instance, academic research, there's a lot of research on human rights in supply chains, but it's often not very applied. Not very applied in the sense offering concrete solutions, but also not very applied to university context. The human rights policies of universities have mostly focused on human rights in international partnerships, for instance, Ethiopia, Iran, Israel, not so much on this issue of supply chains. It's in the VLIR guidelines, but I don't think there's a lot of universities that have taken concrete steps as of now. Of course, we're trying to do this now, but this is still a domain that is unexplored. Sustainable procurement, there are initiatives, but by and large, mostly focused on green procurement and environment. And overall, we feel that there's really a need for a coordinated approach that tries to bring together different actors within university, researchers, policymakers, administrative staff, and really try to work together around this theme and see how we can join forces. Okay, then procurement legislation. And procurement practice can be a straitjacket, but can also be an opportunity. Certain obstacles, for instance, a longer-term engagement with suppliers is difficult because you build up an engagement with a supplier, but it might be that after a couple of years you have a new supplier, so you have to not start from scratch, but at least, I mean, it creates a new challenge. Proportionality requirements, I mean, in essence, it means that you as a buyer cannot request certain sustainability policies from your supplier as a company, but only in relation to the specific products you're buying. And that is, of course, a limitation. Opportunities, of course, the weakness of having new tenders also creates an opportunity for engagement each time you have a new tender. For instance, the market consultations, I think, is an instrument that could be used very good in this context. There's clear capacity constraints on the part of buyers. We cannot dump all of the responsibility on public buyers because that's not their primary role. And if we do that, responsibility needs to be backed up with support. And that is, of course, the key question. I mean, it's about the money and what do you want to invest as a university. And then an important observation is, of course, monitoring suppliers remains the #1 challenge. You can put clauses and criteria into documents, but monitoring what happens after is the obvious challenge. I mean, I'm projecting the different notes we've published. They're accessible online. I won't go into each of them, but we'll send the links afterwards. Another lesson, the anatomy of supply chains matters. Both in the case of ICT and academic literature, it's large companies that exercise a large degree of control over their suppliers, but they have different incentives. In the case of ICT, it's quite a competitive market that has already long faced public scrutiny over human rights and environmental challenges. So they were quite willing to engage in discussion with us, and they already had a story that was not foolproof, but at least there was a clear policy and we could engage in discussion. Academic literature is a whole other story because, of course, these publishers exercise a large degree of control over universities as well as their suppliers. And there was no public scrutiny about these specific issues, so they didn't have the incentive to really engage in the discussion that would expose them as a company that faces risks. In the case of UZ Leuven, the supplier is an SME, and the power did not lie primarily with the SME. The company in question was quite willing to engage in dialogue. The problem was that the suppliers of this company were not really willing to engage in a dialogue, and then, of course, you hit a wall. And then finding out how to move past that wall is quite a challenge, I must say. How many do I have left? 3, 2? Okay. A supplier dialogue on human rights is very much, especially for the buyers themselves, a leap into the dark, but I think that's fine. It's important to have an open dialogue. It's not meant to be an inquisition. You don't confront. Of course, you confront the supplier, but it's not that you want to confront him openly and really in an aggressive way. Try to engage in an open discussion, ask simple questions, but ambitious questions that enable mutual learning. You don't know a lot of things, but often the supplier doesn't know a lot of things either. So it's really a question of engaging. Focus on specific products. If you don't, they will often tell you a very nice CSR story. So what we did, for instance, it was the Advice of Electronics Watch. We took the SKU codes at the back of a computer, And we asked HP, please provide us with the details of where these computers come from, where the components come from. And actually, quite a lot turned out to be possible. Also, in case something goes wrong with a computer, HP will be perfectly capable of telling you where it came from. If it's about human rights, it's often a more difficult story. Dare to question your own procurement practices. How are you buying products? If you request full flexibility and on-time delivery from your suppliers, of course, that might have an impact on the work floor. And increased leverage through stakeholder engagement and collective action. As a university, of course, KU Leuven has a certain degree of leverage. Not all universities, let alone local authorities, have the leverage to push suppliers. So try to engage in stakeholder engagement, collective action. And then the final one, and that is actually one of the key lessons for today, there are no shortcuts from pilots to systematics. Universities are highly bureaucratic. It's very difficult to move an organization like KU Leuven. Finding moral support for human rights is easy. No one is against human rights. Finding operational and I would say financial support is the difficult story. There are clear tensions, I think, between socially responsible procurement and commercially viable supply chains, especially in a context that we have today where supply is all but guaranteed. And there are also, and that is I think the bad news for the public buyers especially, there is a tension between one-stop shop solutions, so solutions that offer an easy way out, and the complexity of supply chains. But we simply have the task ahead of us and we have to find ways of dealing with this. So I think that would be the message. So thank you.